By the dawn of the 14th century, there were two sizable kingdoms in Western Europe, England and France. The Kingdom of England was in a pretty good situation. While the Irish had essentially pushed the English out of Ireland, the English had begun a war of conquest against Scotland in 1296. Additionally, England had control of southwestern France, thanks to a few centuries of political marriages. While technically the English king held his French lands as a vassal of the French king, English monarchs did pretty much what they wanted to in their French territories. In many ways, the 14th century in Europe is shaped by the competition between these two kingdoms, and that's one focus of this lesson. France was the wealthiest and the most populous kingdom in Western Europe at this time, with a population of about 20 million compared to England's 4.5 million, but the English kingdom was more centralized and stronger militarily than the French kingdom. The two countries were related by marriage, most recently in 1308, when Isabella of France, the daughter of French King Philip IV, married King Edward II of England. Despite the familial connections, there was constant minor warfare along the borders of English-controlled territories in France. The French monarchs long feared a possible English invasion from those lands. So, the French responded by pushing England into a corner. They allied with the Scots, who'd been involved in a war against England since 1296. Now, besides their southwestern border, France worried about their northern border, particularly about the expansion of a small state called Flanders. The County of Flanders, which is today part of Belgium, had temporarily won independence from France in 1302, but was brought back under French control 2 years later. However, Flanders was wealthy thanks to its location along trade routes and its production of high-quality wool cloth, so it was largely autonomous. The problem with this autonomy is that Flanders had very strong trade relationships with England. The Flemish, what the people of Flanders are called, used English wool to make their famous cloth. To complicate matters, French nobility highly prized Flanders cloth. In fact, in an era when most trade was conducted through barter in kind, which means exchanging one product for another without the use of money, French nobility paid for their Flanders cloth with French wine. In turn, the Flemish purchased their English wool with this French wine. Thus, despite the political tensions, there were economic connections between these three states. Regardless of economic or political issues, we can also think of the increasing tensions as a family affair. As mentioned previously, the English and French nobility had been intermarrying for centuries. The medieval Kingdom of England had been conquered in 1066 by a French duke named William, and thereafter known as the Conqueror. William's granddaughter, Matilda, was married to a French noble named Geoffrey, whose family were the Counts of Anjou, a territory in western France. Matilda's son, Henry, became the King of England in 1154 upon the death of his uncle Stephen. 2 years prior to becoming king, Henry had married Eleanor, who was the Duchess of Aquitaine. That means that Henry became the Duke of Aquitaine. Together they controlled a sizable territory in southwestern France, which comprised of Aquitaine and Anjou and a few other lands. Now, Eleanor had been married before. Her first marriage was to King Louis VII of France. Louis had had that marriage annulled because Eleanor had just turned 30 and was considered close to the end of her childbearing years. That first marriage had only resulted in 2 daughters who, according to French law, could not inherit property, including the throne of France, so Louis needed a new wife to give him sons. Despite the fact that Eleanor was 30, about 10 years older than her second husband Henry, she and Henry nonetheless had 8 children together, the youngest of which, John, was born when Eleanor was about 44. John continued the tradition of marrying French nobility when he married Isabel of Angoulême in 1200. John's grandson would marry a French noblewoman as well. In fact, he'd marry a French princess, Isabella, in 1308. Isabella of France's father died in 1314. By that point, Isabella was 19, and she'd been married for almost 6 years. She and her husband, Edward, had a 4-year-old son, also named Edward. Isabella's father was succeeded by his oldest legitimate son, Louis X, who unfortunately died in 1316. Louis was briefly succeeded by his newborn son John, who lived for approximately 5 days. John was then succeeded by Philip V, Isabella's second oldest brother, and upon his death in 1322, Philip was succeeded by Charles IV, Isabella's third oldest brother. The 1320s were difficult for the English royal family. Edward and Isabella's marriage was strained by court changes. In 1325, Isabella had been sent to France to negotiate a treaty. Instead, she allied with a strong English noble and returned to England with the express purpose of pushing her husband off the throne. The move worked. Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son in 1327. And then Edward died under really mysterious circumstances while imprisoned later that year. And then, in 1328, King Charles IV of France died without any male heirs. In England, the death of Charles IV would have resulted in Charles's closest male heir inheriting the throne. His closest male heir was his nephew Edward, his sister Isabella's oldest son, and, by 1328, the new King of England. In France, however, succession rules are different. Ancient Salic law states that property, and that would include the throne, could not descend through a female. Since Edward was related to Charles through a female, Edward's mother was Charles's sister, Edward was not eligible to inherit the French throne. So the French consulted their genealogy charts and then crowned Philip of Valois, a nephew of Philip IV, as the new King of France. He became Philip VI. 15-year-old Edward III was not amused by this news. However, Edward III hadn't really expected to inherit the French throne, and he had other concerns, among them revolts in Scotland. Throughout the early 1330s, political tensions between Edward III and Philip VI intensified, and Philip VI began to confiscate English territories in France. The problem was a big one. Basically, Edward III had dragged his feet in swearing allegiance to the new French king, even though he was a vassal of the French king because he held French lands, especially as Duke of Aquitaine. Edward and Philip then struck a deal. Philip would return all of Edward's lands if he'd swear allegiance to the French king. So Edward went through the ceremony in 1329, but later there was a disagreement as to what lands precisely Edward retained control over. That disagreement, along with the continuation of the French-Scots alliance, which threatened England, prompted Edward to challenge Philip VI for the French throne. This was a challenge of the entire feudal system upon which government control was based at that time. There were multiple phases of the war, which did, after all, last 100 years between 1337 and 1453. There were treaties and truces, notably one for the outbreak of the Black Death, but 100 years of fighting essentially translated into multiple generations of warfare between the two kingdoms. For some people who lived at this time, England and France have always been at war, and as far as they were concerned, would always be at war. At the beginning of the war, England had control, primarily because England's experience in fighting the Irish and the Scottish had resulted in shifts within England's military strategy. Plus, they weren't fighting in England. They were fighting in France. By this time, the English army looked quite different from a traditional medieval army. Since the rise of feudalism, most armies had been heavy on the cavalry, knights fighting on horseback, with some infantry, mostly peasants armed with sharp objects, and archers. However, the English had adopted a strategy that saw more infantry than cavalry, and a contingent of pikemen. The pikemen usually stood right behind the archers. They'd also adopted a new kind of bow, the longbow, which was a bow almost as tall as the archer. The bigger bow allowed for the use of longer arrows, and it also propelled those arrows with greater force, enough force to pierce armor. The French, meanwhile, continued to fight in the traditional medieval manner, mostly knights, very few archers, and fewer pikemen still. And they were unprepared for the effectiveness of the English longbowmen. And once the longbowmen or the pikemen had forced the knights to fall from their horses, knights were met with armed infantry as their horses fled the battlefield. While a knight had significant range of motion when on the ground, getting back up on a horse was more difficult, So, once on the ground, these knights effectively became infantry. The next weapon which would make a significant shift in the war is the bombard, what we today call a cannon. The French used the bombard to attack English castles, and slowly they began to take back the territory England had conquered during the first few decades of the war. Of course, the English very quickly acquired their own bombards and in turn attacked French castles, but not before the French had managed to take back much of their territory. In the early 15th century, there was another brief truce after a political marriage between the English king and a French princess. But when the king, Henry V, died in 1422, the war resumed. In 1429, the French received the break they needed, and what indeed appeared to be a message from heaven. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, and she, pretty much single-handedly, turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. Joan was born in 1412, and for the first 17 years of her life was a shepherdess for her father's flocks in eastern France. In 1429, she began to hear voices as she worked alone. Confused about what the voices were saying, she consulted with her parish priest, who realized that the voices Joan was hearing were those of saints, Michael, Catherine, Marguerite, each telling her to save France by defeating the English and retaking important cities. Her priest passed along news of this miracle up the clerical hierarchy, and eventually a meeting with the new king, Charles VII, was arranged. Joan traveled to southern France to deliver her message to the king. Charles seems to have believed this was all a hoax, so he decided to play a trick on this poor peasant woman. At the time, the only people who knew what the monarch looked like were those who worked with him or saw him at court, something a peasant like Joan wouldn't ever have done. So, when Joan appeared at court, the king put one of his nobles on the throne, intending to watch the proceedings as a noble and then have a big laugh at Joan's expense once she left. However, Joan went right up to him in the crowd. She recognized him, knelt before him, and told him of her mission. Shocked out of the joke, Charles agreed to support Joan, and he gave her an army of about 4,000 men. Joan then proceeded to defeat the English, first at Orleans, then at Reims. Joan's leadership had turned the tide of the war. Unfortunately, Joan was caught by the Burgundians and handed over to the English, with whom they were allied. The English, knowing of Joan's story about talking to the saints, accused her of witchcraft. Found guilty, Joan was burnt at the stake. It was a horrific end for a young woman whose only crime was successful military leadership. England's execution of Joan only made her a martyr, and it energized the French cause. In 1453, the French definitively defeated the English, and the English were left with just one tiny little French port at Calais, which they'd lose to the French in 1565. Joan's martyrdom would be celebrated by the French, and, in 1920, she would be canonized, made a saint, in the Roman Catholic Church. Well, besides the territorial shifts, the 100 Years' War, which ended in 1453, had other consequences. England's defeat in the war would lead to domestic political struggles and the outbreak of another war, the War of the Roses, which split the two sides of the English royal family. We'll talk more on that later. The 100 Years' War had challenged the foundation of the feudal system. In 1337, Edward III had decided that, despite being Philip VI's vassal, he would withdraw his fealty, and then he fought for his own rights to his own land. This fight threatened the whole foundation of Western European society, and Europe would begin the slow shift away from feudalism. Moreover, the long experience of this war also challenged traditional ideas of military warfare. The value of the feudal knight was discredited, and kingdoms across Europe would begin to diversify their armies, incorporating more infantry, archers, and bowmen. The downfall of Western Europe's traditional social system was also due to various peasant revolts which had challenged the manorial system. If you'll remember, while the social relationships between the nobility was organized by the feudal system, the social and economic relationships between the noble landowners and their workers, the peasants and the serfs, were organized by the manorial system. Peasants and serfs, as the lowest classes, were often most affected by changes in any economic system. War meant hardship and sacrifice, and taxes. In 1358, French peasants, partly angered by the perceived ineffectiveness of the king's knights in fighting the English, and partly upset by rising taxes and continued hardship, attacked nobles in northern France. Chroniclers record chilling violence, murder of entire noble families, rape of noble women, ransacking of manor houses, before suppression by noble armies. This localized revolt, the Jacquerie, apparently scarred the French nobility enough that the nobility retained an image of peasants as uneducated and violent and bloodthirsty, an image that would still remain 400 years later. England wasn't immune to peasant revolts. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt, or Wat Tyler's Revolt, was the brainchild of Wat Tyler, who led peasant forces against then King Richard II and his never-ending taxes to pay for the war. This rebellion was broader than the one in France, and as part of the initial attempt to suppress the revolt, the king had promised to abolish serfdom. While King Richard eventually went back on that promise, serfdom still began to disappear in England as landowners realized they could make money by allowing serfs to purchase their freedom. Even as the political competition between England and France raged, the Roman Catholic Church was also undergoing significant change that would affect its influence for centuries to come. Since the early 13th century, the Church had been concerned about maintaining its position as both a political force, because remember, popes ruled over the papal states of central Italy as a medieval lord, and as a moral leader. Early in the 13th century, in 1215, Pope Innocent III had called a great church council together in order to develop rules of behavior for the clergy. He was so serious about reform that he even invited Greek Orthodox clergy to attend, and they did. This Fourth Lateran Council formally barred Catholic priests from marrying, and it forbade them from officiating at ordeals and trials by battle, which were pre-Christian traditions of judgment and punishment. This council also formally adopted the dogma of transubstantiation, the belief that, during Mass, the priest converts the substance of bread and wine in communion into the substance of Christ's body and blood, as the council believed the story of the Last Supper documented. The reforms of the 13th century included the expansion of various university systems, all tied in some way to the Church. There was already a medical university in Salerno, a university for legal studies in Bologna, and a university for theological studies in Paris. Oxford University in England was founded after an exodus of disgruntled students and professors left the Paris University. Then Cambridge was founded, and slowly, more universities appeared across Europe. The start of the 14th century, however, brought fractures. In 1302, Pope Boniface VIII outlawed the taxation of clergy across Latin Christendom. This move was interpreted as a reprimand against the kings of England and France. In response, King Philip IV of France sent soldiers to arrest the Pope for interfering in civil matters. Boniface was quickly freed, but died soon after the arrest. The election of the next Pope, Frenchman Clement V, was widely seen as corrupt, as many believed it had been influenced by the French. Clement V, fearing interference and assassination in Italy, decided to move the entire papal court to Avignon, which at that time was right along the border in France. This move was widely interpreted as unmasking Clement as a puppet of the French king. From 1309 to 1376, the seat of the Roman Catholic Church was not in Rome, but in Avignon. A total of 7 popes, all of them French, would lead the church during this papacy. Critics of the move, and of the pope's close ties to the French monarchy, referred to this time as the Babylonian captivity of the church. Some even believed that the Avignon Papacy had resulted in the Black Death, that it was God's punishment for moving the court to Avignon. Finally, in 1376, the last of the Avignon popes, Gregory XI, returned the papal court to Rome. By that time, however, the damage had been done. Many of Europe's nobles and monarchs, such as the English, who were locked in a long war with France, had come to see the church as a puppet of the French monarchy. As a result, the papacy lost its prestige as a universal institution. Unfortunately, the church's attempts to correct the impression made by the 70 years of the Avignon Papacy backfired. Gregory died in 1378, and the College of Cardinals, the body of clergy who elect the Pope, was torn between French and anti-French factions. Each group split, and each group elected its own pope. The French pope moved his followers back to Avignon, while the anti-French pope remained in Rome. The Great Western Schism had begun. The election of two competing popes split Latin Christendom. As you might expect, France and her allies supported the pope at Avignon, while England and her allies supported the pope in Rome. Each pope excommunicated the other and their followers. It was hard to believe that these people all claimed to follow the same set of beliefs. For the next 40 years, the existence of two distinct papal courts further undermined the church's authority. For everyday people, this church disaster, combined with the recent end of the Black Death and the ongoing 100 Years' War, made them think that the end of the world might be close. Some lower-level clergy wrote extensively about the corruption of the church. At Oxford University, John Wycliffe translated the Bible from Latin to English and theorized that the church hierarchy might not be needed for salvation. He preached that everyday devout people could hope to attain heaven by reading the Bible, understanding God's laws, and living according to those laws. Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards, would be persecuted, but they were not alone in their critique. In Bohemia in Central Europe, the Hussites, followers of Jan Hus, protested church corruption and also the oppression of the Bohemians by the German lords who claimed their lands. Both the Lollards and the Hussites would be designated as heretics by the church. Civil authorities used capital punishment to deal with the heretics they caught. Huss was burnt at the stake, and many Lollards suffered the similar fate. Still, their criticisms about church teachings and church hierarchy would continue to challenge the church's authority in Europe. By the time the Great Western Schism finally ended in 1415, the damage done to the church's power and influence was immense. For the next 30 years, the church would continue fighting battles, this time against monarchs who insisted that they had power over the clergy living within their kingdoms. All this continued at the same time as the 100 Years' War was grinding to a close. By the middle of the 15th century, it was clear that significant political change was afoot. Monarchs were increasing their power, the church was faltering in its influence. And the Italian Renaissance? It was about to hit the rest of Europe.